Part 6, The Philly Mob War. Chapter 38, After Scarfo. The steel door of the federal penitentiary closed behind Nicodemo Scarfo in January 1988, but the Philadelphia boss had no intention of relinquishing control. From his cell, Scarfo continued issuing orders, attempting to maintain the iron grip he'd held over South Philadelphia's streets for nearly a decade. His choice for acting boss was Anthony "Tony" Buck Piccolo, a loyal soldier who had stood by Scarfo through the violent years. Yet even Scarfo's most devoted followers understood a fundamental truth. Commanding a criminal organization from behind bars presented challenges that even the most feared boss couldn't entirely overcome. The distance between the prison visiting room and the street corners where the family conducted business created inevitable gaps in authority. Messages passed through intermediaries lost nuance and immediacy. Decisions that once required only Scarfo's word now involved layers of communication, each layer introducing delay and opportunity for misunderstanding. The firm hand that had ruled through fear and personal presence couldn't reach as effectively through prison walls and supervised phone calls. Tony Buck Piccolo found himself in an impossible position. He bore the title of acting boss, yet everyone on the street understood he served merely as Scarfo's representative, a message carrier rather than a true leader. Those who had feared Scarfo's immediate wrath now calculated different risks. The younger members, those who had watched the family's membership devastated by prosecutions and internal violence, began questioning whether the old ways would lead anywhere but prison or the grave. The evening of October 31st, 1989, began like many others at Dante and Luigi's, the venerable Italian restaurant on 10th Street in South Philadelphia. The establishment had served the neighborhood since 1899, its walls holding memories of countless family celebrations, business meetings, and quiet dinners. On this Halloween night, 24-year-old Nicky Scarfo Jr. sat among friends and associates, the son bearing his father's notorious name without yet fully understanding the weight it carried. Shortly after 9 o'clock, a figure entered the restaurant wearing a Batman mask, the disguise an odd mixture of theatrical humor and deadly intent. The masked gunman moved with purpose through the dining room, raising a weapon and firing multiple shots at the younger Scarfo. The bullets struck their target, sending Nicky Jr. to the floor as patrons scrambled for cover and the gunman fled into the South Philadelphia night. Nicky Scarfo Jr. survived the assassination attempt, rushed to hospital with serious wounds that would heal over time. The physical recovery, however, represented only part of the damage inflicted that Halloween evening. The message sent by those bullets traveled through the Philadelphia underworld with perfect clarity. The Scarfo name no longer commanded the fear and respect it once had. Even the boss's own son wasn't untouchable. Law enforcement officials began their investigation with particular interest in Joey Merlino, a rising figure among the younger South Philadelphia faction. Merlino, then in his late 20s, had grown up in the neighborhood, son of underboss Salvatore Merlino. The younger Merlino possessed natural charisma, street credibility, and ambition that extended beyond his father's generation's traditional deference to authority. Wiretaps installed in various locations would later capture conversations between Scarfo Sr. and his son discussing the shooting. The imprisoned boss and his recovering son spoke carefully, aware that their words might be monitored, yet unable to completely mask their suspicions. They named Joey Merlino as the likely shooter, their accusations consistent with law enforcement's own theories. Years would pass before additional evidence emerged. Ralph Natale, who would later cooperate with federal prosecutors, testified that Merlino had confessed the shooting to him. Tommy Scafidi, another mobster facing his own legal troubles, provided similar statements, claiming Merlino had acknowledged pulling the trigger that Halloween night. Joey Merlino consistently denied any involvement in the shooting. He maintained his innocence through questioning, through trials, through decades of speculation. No charges were ever filed connecting him to the attempted murder of Nicky Scarfo Jr. The question of who wore the Batman mask that night remained officially unresolved, though the streets of South Philadelphia drew their own conclusions. By 1991, The commission recognized that Philadelphia required new leadership if the family was to survive. The Scarfo years had produced unprecedented violence, massive federal prosecutions, and internal chaos that threatened the organization's basic ability to function. The families in New York, who maintained ultimate authority over Philadelphia's affairs, turned to a figure who represented stability and traditional values, John Stanfa. Stanfa brought considerable credentials to the position. Born in Sicily, he maintained strong connections to the old country and understood the traditional structure of La Cosa Nostra. He had served under Angelo Bruno, witnessing firsthand how the gentle Don had maintained peace and prosperity through diplomatic leadership. Stanfa had avoided the worst excesses of the Scarfo era, spending much of that violent period in federal custody on charges unrelated to the street wars. The mandate given to Stanfa by New York was straightforward: restore order without generating headlines. The Philadelphia family needed to return to profitable basics: bookmaking, loan sharking, labor racketeering, without the spectacular murders that had brought such intensive law enforcement attention. Stanfa was expected to cool the vendettas that had consumed the organization, to rebuild the depleted ranks, and to distance the family from the toxic legacy of the Scarfo name. Stanfa approached his assignment with traditional thinking. He believed in hierarchy, in respect for authority, in the old Sicilian ways that had governed La Cosa Nostra for generations. He set about rebuilding the family's structure, identifying reliable men for positions of authority, establishing proper procedures for making money and resolving disputes. The new boss emphasized legitimate business interests as fronts for illegal operations. Construction, trash hauling, and various service industries provided both income and cover for the family's activities. Stanfa worked to restore relationships with other crime families that had been strained during the Scarfo years. He presented himself as a steady hand, a return to the proven methods that had worked before Scarfo's violent reign. Yet even as Stanfa worked to establish his authority, resistance was forming among a younger generation of South Philadelphia mobsters. These men, mostly in their 20s and 30s, had come of age during or after the Scarfo era. They had watched older members die violently or disappear into federal prisons. They understood the risks of mob life, but they also understood opportunity. To these younger men, John Stanfa represented everything they rejected. He was a Sicilian import, not a neighborhood product. He spoke with an accent, sometimes conducted business in Italian, and maintained old country customs that seemed archaic to men born and raised on South Philadelphia's streets. His cautious approach to making money, his emphasis on discretion and tradition, struck them as timid in an era when bold moves could yield substantial rewards. Joey Merlino emerged as the natural leader of this younger faction. Handsome, charismatic, and comfortable with media attention, Merlino represented a stark contrast to Stanfa's traditional approach. Where Stanfa valued secrecy, Merlino seemed to enjoy the spotlight. Where Stanfa preached caution, Merlino projected confidence and aggression. Where Stanfa invoked tradition and hierarchy, Merlino suggested that ability and initiative should matter more than age or connections to Sicily. The younger set, who would eventually become known as the Young Turks, began operating with increasing independence. They ran their own crews, conducted their own business, and showed minimal deference to Stanfa's authority. They didn't openly challenge the boss, not yet, but their attitude made clear they considered themselves equals rather than subordinates. Stanfa recognized the brewing problem, but initially tried to address it through traditional means. He attempted to bring the younger men into the formal structure, to offer them positions that would give them stake in respecting his authority. He tried to broker understanding with Salvatore Merlino, hoping the older underboss could control his son. But the generational and cultural gap proved too wide for easy solutions. During this period of growing tension, an important relationship was forming. Joey Merlino encountered Ralph Natali, a considerably older mobster with his own lengthy criminal resume. Natali had operated in the Philadelphia area for decades, connected to the old Bruno network, and possessed extensive knowledge of the organization's history and operations. The friendship that developed between Merlino and Natale might have seemed unlikely on its surface. Natale, 20 years older, represented the previous generation's approach to organized crime, but he shared Merlino's resentment of the current power structure and possessed something the younger man lacked: credibility with old guard mobsters who might otherwise dismiss Merlino as inexperienced. As 1991 progressed into 1992, Philadelphia existed in an uneasy state between the Scarfo chaos and the open warfare that would eventually come. John Stanfa worked methodically to rebuild the family according to traditional principles, showing some success in restoring basic criminal operations and reducing the spectacular violence that had marked the previous decade. The bookmaking and loan sharking operations that formed the family's financial foundation slowly recovered under Stanfa's management. Relationships with corrupt union officials were carefully re-established. Protection rackets in various neighborhoods resumed generating steady income. By traditional measures, Stanfa was accomplishing his mandate, bringing order and profitability back to Philadelphia. Yet beneath this surface stability, the fundamental tensions remained unresolved. The younger South Philadelphia faction continued operating with minimal integration into Stanfa's structure. Joey Merlino's crew maintained its independence, conducting business and generating income without showing proper deference to the boss's authority. Small incidents and perceived slights accumulated, each one adding to a growing reservoir of resentment on both sides. Law enforcement officials monitoring the Philadelphia family recognized the warning signs. Wiretaps and surveillance revealed two distinct factions forming, one centered around Stanfa and his Sicilian associates, the other around Merlino and the young South Philadelphia operators. Informants reported increasing tension at social clubs and neighborhood gathering places. Federal agents prepared for what seemed an inevitable confrontation. The question wasn't whether conflict would erupt, but when and how violently. Would Stanfa move against the younger faction, attempting to reassert control through force? Would Merlino's crew make an open challenge to Stanfa's leadership, or would New York intervene, attempting to mediate before the situation deteriorated into another round of the warfare that had devastated the family during the Scarfo years? The period following Scarfo's imprisonment demonstrated the difficulty of maintaining organized crime leadership during times of major transition. The traditional mechanisms that had governed La Cosa Nostra for generations, respect for hierarchy, fear of consequences, and the Commission's ultimate authority, faced challenges from changing circumstances and shifting cultural attitudes. Scarfo's attempt to rule from prison illustrated the limitations of remote leadership in an organization that had always depended on personal relationships and immediate authority. Tony Buck Piccolo's struggle as acting boss showed how title alone couldn't substitute for the presence and force of personality that effective mob leadership required. The shooting of Nicky Scarfo Jr. represented more than an assassination attempt against one individual. It symbolized the broader breakdown of respect for the Scarfo legacy and the traditional codes that should have protected the boss's family. That someone would dare to target the imprisoned boss's son indicated how thoroughly Scarfo's authority had eroded, how completely the fear he'd once inspired had dissipated. John Stanfa's appointment by New York showed the Commission still exercised formal authority over Philadelphia, still possessed the power to designate leadership. Yet Stanfa's difficulties in establishing actual control demonstrated that formal authority didn't automatically translate to street power, especially when dealing with a younger generation that questioned traditional hierarchies. The relationship between Joey Merlino and Ralph Natale represented a new kind of mob alliance, one based on shared ambition and complementary strengths rather than traditional family or neighborhood ties. It suggested that the Philadelphia underworld was evolving, adapting to new realities even as some figures tried to maintain old structures. As the early 1990s progressed, Philadelphia stood at a crossroads. The path forward remained uncertain, but the key players had taken their positions. Stanfa represented traditional authority and New York's mandate. Merlino represented generational change and South Philadelphia's independence. Between them lay questions about power, respect, and what form the Philadelphia family would take as it moved toward the 21st century. The answers to those questions would be written in blood on Philadelphia's streets in the years to come, another violent chapter in the city's long and turbulent mob history. Chapter 39, The Stanfa-Merlino War, 1992 to 1993. The early morning hours of January 29, 1992, brought an unseasonable chill to South Philadelphia. Felix Bocchino, known throughout the neighborhood as Little Felix, though some still called him by his old nickname Tom Mix, sat in his car outside his home. At 72 years old, Bocchino represented the old guard of Philadelphia's organized crime families. A man who had survived decades in the dangerous profession through loyalty, discretion, and careful management of relationships. John Stanfa had recently selected Bocchino as his choice for underboss, recognizing in the older man both wisdom and trustworthiness. It was a traditional selection, honoring experience and proven dedication to the organization. Bocchino had begun his career in the Philadelphia underworld during the 1940s, working his way through the ranks during an era when organized crime operated under different rules, different codes. As Bocchino sat in his driveway that winter morning, perhaps reviewing the day ahead or simply enjoying a quiet moment, gunmen approached his vehicle. The attack was swift and close range. Multiple shots were fired through the car window at point-blank distance. Bocchino died at the scene, never leaving his vehicle, his body discovered shortly thereafter by family members. The murder of Felix Bocchino marked a definitive break in the Philadelphia family's internal tensions. What had been simmering disagreements between John Stanfa's faction and the younger crew led by Joseph Merlino now transformed into open warfare. The selection of an elderly, traditional underboss had been intended to stabilize Stanfa's administration. Instead, his assassination signaled that negotiation was no longer possible. In the immediate aftermath, Stanfa faced a difficult strategic decision. His natural instinct demanded retaliation, but he also recognized the danger of allowing the family to fracture completely. In an attempt to bridge the generational divide, Stanfa promoted Joseph Changlini Jr., known as Joey Chang, to the position of underboss. Joey Chang was the older brother of Michael Changlini, one of Merlino's closest associates. The promotion represented an olive branch, an acknowledgement that the younger generation needed representation in the family's leadership structure. But trust, once broken, proves difficult to restore. On a March evening in 1993, Michael Mikey Chang Changlini walked home from a neighborhood basketball game. The 29-year-old Changlini, son of Joseph Chicky Changlini and younger brother to Stanfa's newly appointed underboss, had maintained his friendship with Joey Merlino despite his brother's elevation within Stanfa's administration. As he approached his house on McKean Street, Mikey noticed a car parked at the curb, an unusual sight in a neighborhood where residents knew every vehicle. Before Mikey could react, two gunmen emerged from the car and opened fire. The young man ran toward his front door as shotgun blasts echoed through the quiet residential street. His wife stood in the living room, frozen in shock. Upstairs, their 3-year-old son and 2-year-old daughter slept in their bedroom, unaware of the violence erupting below. The attackers had chosen 12-gauge shotguns for the ambush, weapons designed for devastating close-range effect. However, investigators later discovered that the gunmen had loaded their weapons with incorrectly sized shells, causing critical misfires during the attack. This mechanical failure likely saved Mikey Changlini's life. He reached his front door and burst inside, unharmed despite the barrage of gunfire. His family remained safe. John Stanfa had ordered the hit as retaliation for Felix Bocchino's murder, but the attack violated fundamental codes that governed organized crime conduct. Targeting a man at his family home with his wife and children present crossed boundaries that even warring factions traditionally respected. The Italian-American neighborhoods of South Philadelphia operated under unwritten rules. Disputes between men should not endanger women and children. The failed assassination of Mikey Chang had immediate consequences. Rather than intimidating Merlino's faction, the botched hit strengthened their resolve. The younger crew recognized that Stanfa had abandoned traditional restraints. If family homes were now legitimate targets, if children could be endangered by stray shotgun pellets, then the conflict had entered territory where old codes no longer applied. Paradoxically, Stanfa attempted another reconciliation effort in September 1992. In a formal ceremony, he officially inducted both Joey Merlino and Mikey Changlini as made members of the Philadelphia family. The ritual carried deep significance, becoming a made man represented a lifetime bond, a sacred commitment to the organization and its leadership. Stanfa hoped that by extending this honor to Merlino and his closest ally, he could bind them to the family's traditional hierarchy through ceremony and oath. For a few months, the violence subsided. The newly made men participated in family business, attended meetings, and observed the protocols expected of initiated members. But beneath the surface, calm, fundamental tensions remained unresolved. The murder of Felix Bocchino had not been answered. The attack on Mikey Chang's home had not been forgotten. Trust remained absent. By early 1993, as winter loosened its grip on Philadelphia, the fragile peace collapsed. March 2nd, 1993, dawned cold and clear. At approximately 6 o'clock in the morning, Joseph Changlini Jr. prepared to open his luncheonette at the corner of 3rd and Porter Streets in South Philadelphia. The small diner represented legitimate business for the family's underboss, a neighborhood establishment where residents gathered for breakfast and conversation. Joey Chang had arrived early, as was his habit, to prepare for the morning rush. A car pulled to the curb outside the diner. Several masked gunmen exited the vehicle and rushed through the front door. The only other person present was a waitress who had arrived moments earlier to begin her shift. The attackers moved quickly, surrounding Joey Chang and opening fire with handguns at close range. Multiple shots struck Stanfa's underboss as he stood near the counter. The gunmen then fled to their waiting vehicle and disappeared into the early morning streets. The waitress, traumatized by what she had witnessed, would later give investigators a confused account of the attack. She couldn't say with certainty how many shooters there had been, whether 3 or 4 or 5. Their faces had been covered. Everything had happened so quickly. Her testimony, along with conflicting statements from other potential witnesses, would create complications during subsequent legal proceedings. What remained indisputable was the condition of Joseph Changlini Jr. The bullets had caused catastrophic injuries, leaving him in a comatose vegetative state from which he would never recover. Stanfa's carefully chosen underboss, the bridge between old and young, the symbol of family unity, had been removed from power through violence. Lying paralyzed in a hospital bed, his consciousness never to fully return. The FBI had anticipated that Merlino's faction might target Joey Chang. Federal agents had installed hidden surveillance cameras in the diner, capturing blurry footage of shadowy figures carrying out the attack. The video quality proved insufficient for positive identification, but it documented the brazen nature of the assault, an attempted execution in a public establishment at dawn. With no apparent concern for witnesses or consequences, the attack on Joseph Changlini Jr. marked the formal beginning of all-out war. Stanfa's organization had now been decapitated, his underboss removed even more completely than Felix Bocchino had been. The boss himself recognized that any pretense of family unity had dissolved. The younger faction would not be reconciled, would not be integrated, would not be controlled. John Stanfa began planning a response that would demonstrate his own capacity for ruthless action. The morning of August 5, 1993, found Joey Merlino and Mikey Chang standing on the sidewalk outside their clubhouse on South 8th Street, near Catherine Street. At 32 and 30 years old respectively, the two men had been friends since childhood. Growing up in the same neighborhood, attending the same schools, and eventually entering the same profession, their friendship represented the core of the younger faction, personal loyalty that transcended organizational politics. Around 9 o'clock, a Chevy Malibu approached their location. The vehicle slowed as it drew alongside the two men. Inside sat John "Johnny" Vesey, a Stanfa enforcer, with Philip Coletti serving as driver. Vesey leaned from the passenger window, a 9mm pistol in his hand, and began firing. The gunman emptied his magazine in a sustained burst, 10 to 15 shots fired in rapid succession. On the street, chaos erupted. Michael Cianglini was struck multiple times, bullets tearing through his chest and abdomen. He collapsed to the pavement. Joey Merlino also went down, hit 4 times in the leg and buttocks. The Chevy Malibu accelerated away as witnesses scattered, and the sound of gunfire echoed off the narrow street's brick buildings. Michael "Mikey" Cianglini died from his wounds shortly after the attack. The young man who had survived the shotgun ambush at his family home, who had been inducted as a made man alongside his best friend, who had a wife and children waiting for him, bled out on a South Philadelphia sidewalk on a summer morning. Joey Merlino survived his injuries, though the 4 bullet wounds required extensive medical treatment. The young faction leader would recover physically, but the psychological impact of losing his closest friend and strategist proved more difficult to measure. Mikey Chang had been more than an ally. He had been a brother in everything but blood, a lifelong companion whose death left a void that could never be filled. The hit team's escape nearly failed. The Chevy Malibu was registered to Philip Coletti, a critical oversight in operational planning. Realizing that witnesses might have noted the license plate, Vesey and Coletti decided to destroy the evidence by setting the vehicle on fire. In attempting to torch the car, John Vesey severely burned his own hands, injuries that would require medical attention and create their own evidentiary trail. The daylight murder of a mob capo and the wounding of a boss's son sent shockwaves through Philadelphia's underworld and law enforcement community alike. The violence had escalated beyond isolated incidents to something approaching urban warfare. Federal agents heightened surveillance efforts, fearing that further bloodshed was inevitable as both sides sought revenge. For Joey Merlino, his friend's death hardened whatever resolve had remained flexible. John Stanfa had now killed Michael Cianglini and wounded Merlino himself. The accounts demanded balancing. The faction that Mikey Chang had helped build would carry forward his memory through action. The response came before the month ended. On the morning of August 31st, 1993, John Stanfa departed for work as usual. The 53-year-old boss traveled in his Cadillac Seville, accompanied by his 23-year-old son Joseph Jr. and his associate Fred Aldrich, who served as driver. The route took them onto the Schuylkill Expressway, Interstate 76, during the height of morning rush hour. Hundreds of commuters surrounded them on the busy highway, heading into the city for another workday. A white van pulled alongside the Cadillac in the morning traffic. The van had been modified with custom-cut gun ports in its side panels, openings through which weapons could be fired, while the shooters remained concealed inside the vehicle. As the two vehicles traveled side by side at highway speed, automatic weapons emerged from these ports and opened fire. The barrage was intense, likely a submachine gun, perhaps an Uzi or Mac-10, along with other automatic weapons. Bullets struck the Cadillac repeatedly, shattering windows and puncturing the vehicle's body. Joseph Stanfa Jr. was hit in the jaw and neck, grievous facial wounds that caused immediate, profuse bleeding. John Stanfa himself ducked below the dashboard as rounds tore through the car's interior. Fred Aldrich, demonstrating remarkable composure under fire, executed a defensive maneuver. Rather than attempting to flee or simply enduring the attack, he turned the Cadillac into the van, ramming the attacking vehicle and forcing it off the road. The collision broke off the assault. The van's occupants, their ambush disrupted, accelerated away and eventually abandoned the vehicle. Other motorists on the expressway witnessed the mobile gunfight with shock and disbelief. This was not a secluded industrial area or a dark alley. This was a major interstate highway filled with civilians during morning rush hour. The brazenness of the attack suggested that Merlino's faction had moved beyond caring about public exposure or collateral damage. The audacity was both their strength and their vulnerability. Joseph Stanfa Jr. survived his facial gunshot wounds, Their recovery required extensive medical intervention. His father, the intended primary target, emerged unharmed, but the psychological impact of the highway ambush affected John Stanfa profoundly. The attack had endangered his son, violated every remaining boundary, and demonstrated that Merlino's crew would stop at nothing to kill him. The FBI increased its scrutiny dramatically, establishing 24-hour surveillance and coordination, fearing that the public nature of mob violence threatened broader safety. Federal agents recognized that if gangland warfare could erupt on a crowded interstate at 9 in the morning, nowhere in Philadelphia remained truly safe. John Stanfa's response came 17 days later. Frank Baldino was 28 years old, worked as a bartender, and knew Joey Merlino socially. He was not a made man, not a capo, not a soldier. Baldino's connection to organized crime existed primarily through friendship and neighborhood association. He represented the periphery of the underworld, someone who knew certain people, who might occasionally relay messages or provide small favors, but who held no formal position within any criminal organization. On the evening of September 17, 1993, Baldino finished dinner at the Melrose Diner on Snyder Avenue, a beloved South Philadelphia institution known for its 24-hour service and classic American menu. After his meal, Baldino walked through the parking lot toward his car, perhaps considering his evening plans, or simply ready to head home after a long day. John Vesey and Giuseppe Gallara, both Stanfa faction members, approached Baldino in the parking lot. Vesey called out to him by name. When Baldino turned to respond, both men opened fire with handguns, Vesey using a .38 caliber revolver, Gallara firing a 9mm. The shots struck Baldino in the head and body. He died in the Melrose Diner parking lot, killed not for anything he had done, but simply because he was known to associate with Joey Merlino's friends. The murder of Frank Baldino shocked even those familiar with mob violence. An essentially uninvolved man, a bartender whose only crime was knowing certain people, had been executed in a family restaurant's parking lot. The killing demonstrated how far the boundaries of acceptable conduct had deteriorated. If mere association now warranted death, then the conflict had metastasized beyond faction warfare into something approaching random terror. Rather than intimidating Merlino's supporters, Baldino's murder turned public sentiment and law enforcement attention even more firmly against John Stanfa. The FBI intensified its investigation. Federal prosecutors began assembling RICO cases. The violence had reached a level where intervention became imperative. For John Vesey, the killing would later prove significant for different reasons. Unlike other murders he had participated in, Baldino's death weighed on Vesey's conscience. The young man had not been a rival, not a threat, not someone who had violated codes or betrayed trust. He had simply been a bartender who knew the wrong people. This realization, combined with Vesey's own legal jeopardy, would eventually contribute to his decision to cooperate with federal authorities. The murder of Frank Baldino proved to be among the last violent acts before law enforcement intervention ended the street phase of the Philadelphia War. On November 8, 1993, FBI agents arrested Joseph Merlino, but not for the murders, attempted murders, or other violence that had characterized the past 2 years. Instead, agents detained Merlino for violating the terms of his supervised release. The 31-year-old faction leader was still on federal parole from a 1990 armored truck theft conviction, with specific conditions prohibiting him from associating with known felons or participating in organized crime activities. FBI simply wanted to keep Joey Merlino out of the streets and focus only on Stanfa. The conditions were, of course, impossible to observe while leading a mob faction in open warfare. Merlino had been meeting regularly with MAID members, planning operations, coordinating responses to attacks, and generally functioning as an organized crime leader. The FBI documented these violations systematically, building an administrative case that required no new trial, no proof beyond reasonable doubt of recent crimes. Merlino had violated his parole conditions. The evidence was clear. His release was revoked. A federal probation officer and U.S. attorney's representatives processed the arrest. No new charges were filed. Merlino was simply returned to federal custody to serve out the remainder of his original sentence, approximately 10 months. This legal maneuver effectively removed the field commander from Merlino's faction at the height of the conflict. Without Joey Merlino's leadership, the younger faction went quiet. Open hostilities in Philadelphia subsided as winter approached and one side's boss sat behind bars. John Stanfa appeared to have gained the upper hand, his primary rival locked away through the very legal system both men had spent their lives evading. But Stanfa's apparent victory proved temporary and ultimately hollow. During Joey Merlino's incarceration, the FBI continued building its case against John Stanfa's organization. The lull in violence provided investigators with time to firm up racketeering evidence through wiretaps, surveillance, and critically cooperating witnesses. John Veazey, troubled by Frank Baldino's murder and facing his own legal exposure, began secret cooperation with federal authorities. Philip Coletti, faced with evidence of his role in the Mikey Chang murder, also agreed to testify. The information provided by these turncoat members proved devastating to Stanfa's defense. They could describe operations from the inside, identify participants in specific crimes, and explain the organizational structure in detail that external surveillance could never capture. Merlino's absence also meant his crew stayed alive, protected in an ironic sense by the FBI's administrative action. The young faction's key members avoided the additional violence that might have occurred had Merlino remained on the streets. They survived to fight another day, to regroup, to prepare for the next phase. Joey Merlino was released from federal custody in November 1994, emerging just as John Stanfa faced his own federal indictment on racketeering charges. The timing allowed Merlino's faction to fill the power vacuum created by Stanfa's legal troubles. In a strategic move that demonstrated political acumen, Merlino installed Ralph Natale as front boss, a respected older member whose traditional credentials could provide legitimacy, while Merlino maintained actual operational control. The arrest that seemed to doom Merlino's faction in November 1993 ultimately preserved him to inherit leadership when Stanfa fell. What began as a parole violation ended as a waiting period, a forced pause that allowed the younger generation to survive long enough to take control. The streets of South Philadelphia had seen extraordinary violence during 1992 and 1993. Felix Bocchino, 72 years old, shot in his driveway. Michael Cianglini, 30, killed on a summer morning sidewalk. Joseph Cianglini Jr. left in a vegetative state he would never escape. Frank Baldino, 28, murdered in a diner parking lot for knowing the wrong people. Joseph Stanfa Jr. shot in the face on a crowded highway. Joey Merlino, wounded 4 times but surviving to continue the fight. The war had broken every traditional code, endangered civilians, and brought unprecedented federal attention to Philadelphia's organized crime families. It represented a generational conflict as much as a power struggle, old guard traditions versus young Turk ambition, patience versus audacity, accommodation versus confrontation. When the shooting stopped and the legal proceedings began, the casualty count extended beyond those killed or wounded. The Philadelphia family's reputation, its operational security, its ability to conduct business without constant law enforcement scrutiny, all had been damaged, perhaps irreparably. The young faction led by Joey Merlino had survived. John Stanfa's traditional approach had failed, but survival and victory were not necessarily the same thing. As winter darkness settled over South Philadelphia in late 1993, the streets grew quiet. The war's immediate phase had ended, but its consequences would shape Philadelphia's underworld for years to come. As federal prosecutors prepared cases, cooperating witnesses rehearsed testimony, and a new generation prepared to assume control of a family that had paid dearly for the privilege of leadership. The blood had dried on the pavement. The bullet holes had been patched. The funerals had been conducted. But the deeper wounds, the broken trust, the violated codes, the accumulated grief, those would prove harder to repair. In the neighborhoods where these men had grown up, where their families still lived, where their children played in the same parks and attended the same schools, life continued. Residents learned to look away from certain conversations, to forget certain faces, to avoid certain questions. This had always been the neighborhood's way. The silence that allowed normal life to continue alongside activities that could never be discussed. As 1993 gave way to 1994, federal investigators assembled their evidence, cooperating witnesses provided their testimony, and prosecutors prepared indictments that would bring more than a dozen defendants to trial. The violence had moved from the streets to the courtrooms, from guns to legal briefs, from hitmen to attorneys. The Philadelphia Mafia War's active combat phase had ended. Its legal consequences were just beginning. Chapter 40, The Stanfa-Merlino War, 1993 to 1995, Final Acts. As winter settled over Philadelphia in early 1994, John Stanfa faced a problem that had plagued crime bosses throughout history, the question of loyalty. For 2 years, the streets of South Philadelphia had echoed with gunfire as Stanfa's imported Sicilian faction battled Joey Merlino's homegrown crew. Now, paranoia crept into Stanfa's inner circle like frost spreading across a windowpane. Among Stanfa's most trusted enforcers was a young man named John Veazey. Known in the neighborhood as John, the 27-year-old had proven himself willing to do whatever the organization required. He had stood alongside Stanfa's soldiers through the bloodiest moments of the conflict. But in the hidden world of organized crime, trust was a commodity that could evaporate overnight. What Stanfa didn't know, as January 1994 began, was that his suspicions about Veazey were entirely correct. Just 3 days earlier, the young enforcer had made the most consequential decision of his life. In a quiet office building far from the streets where he'd made his reputation, John Veazey had begun talking to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The exact date remains uncertain in the historical record, but sometime in mid-January 1994, Stanfa made his move. He ordered 2 of his soldiers, Frank Martins and Vincent Pagano, to eliminate the potential threat. Pagano carried a nickname that spoke to the old neighborhood traditions, Al Pajamas. Together, these men were tasked with silencing someone they had worked alongside for years. Veazey was lured to a private residence in South Philadelphia. The details of that winter day survived through Veazey's own testimony, delivered later in a federal courtroom. He would describe entering a familiar setting, meeting with men he considered friends. In the world of organized crime, such meetings happened constantly, discussions of territory, money, the endless logistics of illegal enterprise. Then, without warning, Frank Martins drew a .22 caliber pistol. In the cramped space of that South Philadelphia room, Martinez spoke 2 words that Veazey would never forget. "Bye, Johnny." The small caliber weapon discharged at point-blank range. The bullet struck Veazey in the back of the head. Then another round. Martins fired into Veazey's face, then his chest. The .22 caliber bullets, known in criminal circles for their lethality at close range, tore through flesh and bone. But John Veazey did not die. What happened next defied the basic assumptions of mob execution. The bullets that should have killed Veazey instantly had somehow failed to destroy the vital structures of his brain. Martins, seeing his target still moving, drew a knife. The 2 men struggled. Veazey managed to wrench the blade away and turned it on his attacker. In the chaos of that room, the clean execution had become a desperate fight for survival. Somehow, with 2 bullets lodged in his skull, Veazey staggered from that house. He found help. He was rushed to a Philadelphia hospital where surgeons worked to save a man who, by all medical logic, should already have been dead. In a hospital bed, bandaged and scarred, John Veazey made his second life-altering decision in a matter of days. The friends who had said "Bye, Johnny" and pulled the trigger had removed any remaining doubts about cooperation. Within days of the failed execution, Veazey formally entered the Federal Witness Protection Program. The man who had been an insider in Stanfa's organization would now become the government's most valuable asset in dismantling it. The botched execution on that January day would prove catastrophic for John Stanfa in ways he couldn't yet imagine. As winter gave way to early spring, federal prosecutors prepared their case. For 2 years, the FBI had been gathering evidence through methods that would have seemed impossible a generation earlier. Hidden microphones captured conversations in places mob bosses had traditionally considered safe. Stanfa, like many of his generation, assumed that certain locations remained privileged, protected from surveillance. FBI agents had obtained warrants to place listening devices in Stanfa's attorney's office. They had bugged his doctor's office. These were spaces where mob protocol traditionally required silence, where the code of Omerta seemed most secure. Instead, Stanfa had unwittingly discussed family business in rooms where federal agents recorded every word. Combined with John Vesey's insider knowledge, these recordings painted a detailed picture of a criminal enterprise. The evidence documented not just individual crimes, but the structure of an organization, who gave orders, who carried them out, how money flowed through the system. On March 7, 1994, that evidence transformed into action. That morning, across Philadelphia and southern New Jersey, FBI agents executed synchronized raids. The operation had been planned with military precision. At multiple locations, doors opened to federal agents with arrest warrants. John Stanfa himself was taken from his home earlier than the first lights of the morning. By the end of that March day, Stanfa and 23 members of his organization sat in federal custody. The indictment read like a comprehensive history of the war that had consumed South Philadelphia. Charges included the murders of Michael Cianglini and Frank Baldino, the attempted murders of Joey Merlino and John Vesey, extortion, weapons violations, racketeering. The formal legal language described an enterprise built on violence and intimidation. It was the largest organized crime case in Philadelphia's history at that time. The immediate effect on the streets was silence. Not the peace of reconciliation, but the quiet that follows when one side of a conflict simply ceases to exist. Stanfa's entire leadership structure sat behind bars awaiting trial. His crews had no direction, no orders, no organizational coherence. Joey Merlino's faction, by contrast, remained largely untouched by the March arrests. The younger generation of South Philadelphia mobsters, many still facing their own legal challenges from earlier incidents, nonetheless represented the only active organized crime presence on the streets. The war had not ended through negotiation or victory in battle. It had ended because federal law enforcement removed one combatant entirely from the field. As autumn arrived in 1995, John Stanfa sat in a federal courtroom facing the accumulated evidence of his brief reign as family boss. The trial would last 15 weeks, a parade of witnesses, wiretap recordings, and forensic evidence. But the prosecution's most compelling witness remained John Vesey, the young enforcer who had survived the unsurvivable. October 5, 1995, was scheduled as a crucial day in the trial. John Vesey was set to take the stand, to testify about the inner workings of Stanfa's organization. That morning, before dawn broke over South Philadelphia, gunmen intercepted a car near the intersection of 20th and Moyer-Mensing Avenue. The driver was William Vesey. Billy, as he was known in the neighborhood, was 33 years old. He was John Vesey's older brother. He was not involved in organized crime. He was not cooperating with federal authorities. He was simply the brother of a man who had chosen to testify. Multiple gunshots shattered the quiet morning. Billy Vesey died in his car, murdered hours before his brother was scheduled to take the witness stand. Philadelphia police stated publicly what everyone understood. This appeared to be retaliation for John Vesey's cooperation. The timing left no room for alternative interpretation. The message was clear: testify against the mob, and your family pays the price. The federal marshals informed John Vesey of his brother's death. They offered to postpone his testimony. Vesey, grief-stricken, chose to proceed. That same day, with 2 bullets still embedded in his skull from the attempt on his own life, he walked into the courtroom and began his testimony. The murder of Billy Veazey represented the final violent act in the Stanfa era, whether ordered by remnants of Stanfa's organization or, as some sources suggest, by Merlino's faction seeking revenge for Michael Cianglini. The killing demonstrated the ongoing cost of the mob war. The hit team was never positively identified. To this day, no one has been convicted of Billy Veazey's murder. But the killing failed in its apparent purpose. John Veazey's testimony continued. The weight of evidence, built over 2 years of investigation, proved overwhelming. On November 21, 1995, after deliberating on 15 weeks of testimony, a federal jury delivered its verdict. John Stanfa was convicted of racketeering and leading a criminal enterprise engaged in murder and extortion. The jury acquitted on some specific charges. There remained doubt about certain individual acts. But the core verdict was definitive. Stanfa, at age 55, faced a mandatory life sentence. 7 of his associates were convicted alongside him. Frank Martins, the man who had shot John Veazey at point-blank range, received life in prison. Others faced decades behind bars. The organizational structure that Stanfa had imported from Sicily, that he had tried to impose on South Philadelphia's traditional families, had been completely dismantled by federal prosecution. On July 9, 1996, Judge Edwin Nathans formally imposed the sentence, life in federal prison. John Stanfa would never walk free again. The man who had arrived in Philadelphia with old-world credentials and ambitions to restore traditional Sicilian control would spend his remaining years in the American prison system. The Stanfa-Merlino War, which had begun with the fracturing of the Scarfo family organization, which had erupted into open combat on the streets of South Philadelphia, which had left bodies scattered across the city, had reached its legal conclusion. But the story of Philadelphia's organized crime families did not end with Stanfa's conviction. Joey Merlino, released from prison in late 1994, had already begun reorganizing what remained of the family. Together with Ralph Natale, recently paroled after decades behind bars, a new structure emerged. Natale assumed the position of boss, at least nominally. Merlino became underboss. The younger generation, the crew that had fought Stanfa in the streets, had won not through force of arms but through survival. They had outlasted their enemies. They had weathered the violence. And when the smoke cleared and the courtroom doors closed, they were the ones still standing. In the world of organized crime, that was often the only victory that mattered. The streets of South Philadelphia, which had echoed with gunfire for 2 bloody years, grew quiet once more. The social clubs remained. The neighborhood traditions continued. But the particular violence of the Stanfa era had passed into history, recorded in court transcripts and scattered memories. And somewhere in the federal prison system, John Stanfa began his life sentence. Far from the Sicilian villages where his story had begun, further still from the American dream that had brought so many immigrants to Philadelphia's streets. The war was over. The legal system had rendered its judgment, and the Philadelphia crime family, diminished but not destroyed, would continue into yet another generation. Chapter 41, Merlino Takes Control. In the autumn of 1995, as John Stanfa began his lengthy federal sentence, the Philadelphia crime family found itself at a crossroads. The violence of the previous years had decimated the organization's ranks and brought unwanted scrutiny from law enforcement. Into this vacuum stepped an unlikely partnership that would define Philadelphia organized crime for the remainder of the decade. Ralph Natale, a veteran mobster who had spent 16 years in federal prison on arson and drug trafficking charges, emerged as the nominal boss of the Philadelphia family. His selection appeared to restore traditional leadership to the organization. At 60 years old, Natale possessed the credentials and experience expected of a Mafia don. He had maintained connections throughout his imprisonment and commanded respect among the remaining members of Philadelphia's criminal underworld. However, beneath this veneer of traditional succession lay a different reality. The true power in the organization rested with Joseph "Skinny Joey" Merlino, the young South Philadelphia gangster who had survived the brutal war with John Stanfa. At 33 years old, Merlino controlled the muscle and the street operations that generated the family's income. The arrangement benefited both men. Natale gained the position and prestige of leadership, while Merlino wielded actual control over criminal operations while directing law enforcement attention toward his nominal superior. This power-sharing arrangement represented a calculated strategy on Merlino's part. Federal prosecutors and FBI agents naturally focused their investigative resources on the recognized boss of a crime family. By elevating Natale to the figurehead position, Merlino created a buffer between himself and law enforcement scrutiny. He could expand the family's criminal enterprises while maintaining a lower profile than the official family boss. The strategy reflected Merlino's understanding of how modern law enforcement operated. Wiretaps, surveillance teams, and investigative resources typically targeted the recognized leadership of organized crime families. By allowing Natale to occupy that position, Merlino theoretically reduced his own exposure to the most intensive forms of law enforcement attention. For a time, this arrangement appeared to work as intended. Joseph Merlino's approach to organized crime leadership marked a dramatic departure from decades of Mafia tradition. Where previous Philadelphia bosses like Angelo Bruno had maintained quiet, low-profile existences, Merlino embraced public visibility with an enthusiasm that shocked both law enforcement and traditional organized crime figures. He transformed himself into what the media would characterize as a celebrity gangster, actively courting the attention that his predecessors had spent their careers avoiding. Merlino's headquarters became the Bon Bon restaurant on South 10th Street, in the heart of South Philadelphia. Unlike the discreet social clubs used by previous crime bosses, the Bon Bon served as an openly acknowledged gathering place where Merlino held court surrounded by his associates. The restaurant became so closely associated with Merlino that its very name entered the lexicon of Philadelphia crime reporting, serving as shorthand for the new regime's brazen public presence. His personal style reinforced this high-visibility approach. Merlino dressed in expensive designer suits and maintained an image that cultivated comparisons to Hollywood depictions of organized crime figures. He traveled with a large entourage through South Philadelphia's streets, stopping at restaurants and clubs where his arrival created a notable commotion. Rather than avoiding cameras, Merlino often acknowledged their presence with a wave or a smile, treating media attention as something to be managed rather than avoided. The press quickly seized upon this accessible gangster, dubbing him the John Gotti of Passyunk Avenue, in reference to both his sartorial style and his candid demeanor before news cameras. The comparison to New York's infamous Gambino crime family boss was apt in many ways. Like Gotti, Merlino seemed to enjoy his notoriety and the public attention that came with his criminal reputation. Where Gotti had held court at the Ravenite Social Club in Manhattan's Little Italy, Merlino made South Philadelphia's Italian market area his personal domain. This public persona extended beyond mere visibility. Merlino actively cultivated an image of the benevolent neighborhood boss, a throwback to an earlier era when organized crime figures positioned themselves as community benefactors. Each Christmas season, he organized highly publicized charity events, distributing meals to homeless residents of Philadelphia. At Thanksgiving, his crew arranged turkey giveaways in public housing projects throughout South Philadelphia. Local media covered these events extensively, providing Merlino with positive publicity that contrasted sharply with his criminal activities. The motivation behind these charitable displays was complex. On one level, they served to build goodwill within the South Philadelphia community where Merlino operated. Creating an image as a neighborhood benefactor potentially insulated him from community cooperation with law enforcement investigations. The events also fed Merlino's apparent desire for recognition and celebrity, allowing him to position himself as a Robin Hood figure rather than simply a criminal. However, this high-profile approach contradicted fundamental principles that had governed successful organized crime operations for generations. The traditional Mafia code emphasized omerta, the vow of silence that extended beyond merely refusing to cooperate with law enforcement. It encompassed a broader principle of maintaining secrecy and avoiding any public attention that might facilitate prosecution. Angelo Bruno had exemplified this approach, conducting business so quietly that many Philadelphia residents remained unaware of his position atop the local crime family. Merlino's flamboyant style troubled many traditional organized crime figures who viewed publicity as fundamentally dangerous. Every photograph in the newspaper, every television news segment showing Merlino on the street, provided prosecutors with evidence of associations and activities. The large entourage that accompanied Merlino everywhere created additional investigative targets, as law enforcement could identify and potentially flip members of his inner circle. The charity events, while generating positive press, also created documented evidence of his leadership position and financial resources. Critics within the organization and in other crime families questioned whether Merlino's approach represented genuine confidence or dangerous arrogance. Some saw his public persona as a calculated strategy to normalize his presence in the community and build a public relations defense against prosecution. Others viewed it as reckless self-aggrandizement that would inevitably draw the intense law enforcement scrutiny that publicity inevitably attracted. Time would demonstrate which assessment proved more accurate. Beneath the public spectacle of Merlino's leadership, the Philadelphia crime family operated a diverse portfolio of criminal enterprises throughout the Delaware Valley. The family's traditional revenue sources remained gambling, loan sharking, and extortion, but the organization expanded and refined these activities during the Natale Merlino era. Court records and federal testimony would later reveal the scope and sophistication of these operations. Illegal gambling formed the foundation of the family's criminal income. The organization operated extensive bookmaking operations throughout Philadelphia and southern New Jersey, taking bets on sporting events, horse racing, and numbers games. These gambling operations required significant infrastructure, including runners who collected bets, bookkeepers who tracked wagers and payouts, and enforcers who collected debts from losing bettors. The family controlled multiple independent bookies, who paid a percentage of their profits in exchange for permission to operate within family territory, and protection from both rival criminals and law enforcement. The family's gambling operations extended beyond traditional bookmaking. They operated illegal video poker machines in bars, restaurants, and social clubs throughout their territory. These machines generated steady income with minimal overhead, as establishment owners typically received a percentage of the profits in exchange for placing the machines on their premises. The family also maintained interests in illegal card games and dice games, taking a percentage of the pot in exchange for providing locations and security for high-stakes gambling sessions. Loan sharking complemented the gambling operations naturally, as bettors who accumulated gambling debts often borrowed money from the same organization that held their markers. The family's loan sharking operation advanced money at usurious interest rates, typically starting at 5% per week and escalating for borrowers who fell behind on payments. These rates meant that a $1,000 loan could generate $50 per week in interest indefinitely, as borrowers often could only afford to pay the weekly interest without reducing the principal balance. The mechanics of loan sharking created a perpetual revenue stream. Borrowers who missed payments faced escalating consequences, beginning with harassment and threats, progressing to physical intimidation, and potentially culminating in violence. However, the organization generally preferred to keep borrowers paying indefinitely rather than using violence that might eliminate the revenue source. A borrower who faithfully paid weekly interest represented more long-term value than a defaulted loan, regardless of the satisfaction violence might provide. Extortion operations expanded significantly under Merlino's leadership, targeting both legitimate businesses and criminal enterprises. The family claimed territorial control over South Philadelphia and portions of southern New Jersey, demanding payments from various businesses operating within these areas. Construction companies faced demands for payment to avoid labor problems or vandalism, Restaurants and nightclubs paid for permission to operate without interference. Even some legitimate businesses found themselves subject to demands for regular payments, disguised as consulting fees or payments for non-existent services. The extortion schemes demonstrated considerable sophistication in their execution. Rather than crude demands backed solely by threats of violence, the organization often employed subtler approaches. They might offer protection against problems that they themselves would create if payment was refused. They positioned themselves as problem solvers who could prevent labor disputes, arrange favorable vendor relationships, or ensure smooth operations, while implicitly threatening to create exactly these problems if their services were declined. Criminal enterprises operating within family territory faced particularly aggressive extortion demands. Independent drug dealers paid a street tax for permission to sell narcotics in South Philadelphia. Illegal gambling operations not directly controlled by the family paid percentages of their profits. Even thieves and fencers who bought and sold stolen goods paid tribute to the organization for the privilege of operating in its territory. This taxation of criminal activity generated significant revenue while requiring minimal direct involvement in the underlying crimes. The stolen goods rackets represented another significant revenue source. The organization maintained relationships with professional thieves who stole merchandise ranging from cigarettes and liquor to electronics and designer clothing. The family operated fences who purchased these stolen goods at a fraction of their retail value and resold them through various channels. Truckload thefts of cigarettes proved particularly lucrative, as the combination of high taxes and easy resale created strong demand for untaxed stolen cigarettes. Labor racketeering provided both income and influence. The family maintained control over certain union locals, particularly in the construction trades. This control allowed them to demand payments from contractors in exchange for labor peace, to secure jobs for associates and family members, and to skim from union benefit funds. The union connections also provided legitimate employment for family members and associates, creating cover stories for their actual income sources. During this period, the family's criminal operations generated millions of dollars annually. However, the organization faced challenges in managing and distributing these proceeds. Unlike legitimate businesses with formal accounting systems, the crime family relied on trust and tradition to track money flows and ensure proper distribution. Disputes over money frequently arose, as members disagreed about proper percentages and questioned whether superiors were fairly distributing proceeds from collective criminal enterprises. As Merlino consolidated his control over Philadelphia's underworld, his personal behavior began to create problems that would ultimately threaten the organization's stability. His approach to gambling debts, in particular, demonstrated an arrogance that alienated potential allies and created unnecessary enemies. The practice, known in criminal circles as guzzling, involved placing large bets with bookmakers and then simply refusing to pay when the bets lost. The mechanics of guzzling revealed much about Merlino's mindset and the corrupting influence of power. When Merlino wanted to bet on sporting events or horse races, he would contact bookmakers and place substantial wagers. If his bets won, he collected his winnings promptly and in full. However, when his bets lost, he would either ignore the debt entirely or offer to pay a small fraction of what he owed, backed by the implicit threat of violence if the bookmaker pressed for full payment. This practice violated fundamental codes of conduct within the gambling underworld. Bookmakers operated on trust and reputation, extending credit to bettors based on their history of paying debts. The system functioned because most bettors, even those with criminal connections, honored their gambling debts. Refusing to pay markers undermined the entire informal credit system that made bookmaking viable. It transformed what should have been legitimate business relationships into extortion schemes. Merlino's guzzling extended beyond independent bookmakers to include bookies operating under the protection of organized crime families. This proved particularly problematic, as it disrespected not only the individual bookmakers but also the crime families that backed them. When Merlino refused to pay debts to mob-connected bookies, he was effectively stealing from other organized crime organizations, a violation of the cooperative arrangements that allowed different families to coexist. The practice generated complaints from crime families in New York, New Jersey, and other jurisdictions where Merlino had placed and defaulted on bets. These families contacted Philadelphia's leadership, seeking satisfaction for Merlino's debts. The complaints placed Ralph Natale in the uncomfortable position of answering for behavior he could not control. As the nominal boss, Natale fielded these complaints and attempted to smooth over the disputes, even as Merlino continued the practice that generated them. The guzzling revealed a broader pattern in Merlino's leadership style. He appeared to believe that his position exempted him from the normal rules and obligations that governed organized crime relationships. Where previous Philadelphia bosses had carefully maintained respectful relationships with other crime families and honored the informal agreements that structured organized crime activity, Merlino's arrogance led him to disregard these conventions. He seemed to view his power as absolute within his territory and his obligations as optional. This attitude extended to his treatment of subordinates and associates within his own organization. Merlino demanded absolute loyalty and obedience from his crew, while displaying little concern for their welfare or interests. Associates who generated significant income for the family often received minimal shares of the proceeds, with Merlino and his closest allies taking disproportionate percentages. Members questioned whether they were receiving fair treatment, creating resentment and discord within the organization. The combination of external disrespect and internal dissatisfaction created conditions ripe for betrayal. Law enforcement agencies seeking to build cases against the organization found potential cooperating witnesses among both those victimized by Merlino's guzzling and those within his own crew who felt shortchanged by his leadership. The arrogance that Merlino displayed in his criminal conduct provided motivation for cooperation that careful, respectful leadership might have prevented. Nevertheless, during the mid to late 1990s, Merlino appeared to operate with impunity. The family's criminal enterprises generated substantial income. His control over South Philadelphia seemed secure. The arrangement with Ralph Natale provided a buffer against law enforcement attention. The public persona he cultivated suggested confidence and power. To outward appearances, Merlino had successfully established himself as the dominant figure in Philadelphia organized crime. However, beneath this surface success, law enforcement was methodically building cases that would ultimately dismantle the organization. The very arrogance and visibility that characterized Merlino's leadership provided prosecutors with evidence and witnesses. The debts he refused to pay created enemies willing to cooperate with investigations. The public spectacle of his charitable events and nightlife appearances generated photographic and video evidence of his activities and associations. The high-profile style that seemed to demonstrate power was simultaneously creating the foundation for his downfall. While Joey Merlino conducted business in South Philadelphia's restaurants and social clubs, a member of his inner circle was systematically documenting the family's criminal activities for the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Ron Previty's transformation from corrupt police officer to mob captain to government informant represented one of the most significant penetrations of Philadelphia organized crime in the family's history. His cooperation would provide prosecutors with detailed evidence of the organization's criminal operations and leadership structure. Previte's background made him a valuable asset to both the crime family and, ultimately, to law enforcement. He had served as a police officer in the Philadelphia suburb of Hamilton, New Jersey, a position that provided both legitimate credentials and opportunities for corruption. During his law enforcement career, Previte developed relationships with criminals and participated in various illegal activities, eventually losing his position due to his corrupt conduct. This background made him an attractive recruit for organized crime, as his law enforcement experience provided useful knowledge and contacts. After leaving the police force, Previte gravitated toward Philadelphia's organized crime family, initially working as an associate before eventually being formally inducted as a made member. His police background proved valuable to the organization. as he understood law enforcement investigative techniques and could provide insights into how authorities might approach their criminal enterprises. He rose through the ranks to become a captain, a position that gave him significant responsibilities within the family's criminal operations. However, Previti's criminal career took a dramatic turn when he was arrested on criminal charges that threatened him with a lengthy federal prison sentence. Facing this prospect, he made the decision to cooperate with federal authorities. Beginning in the mid-1990s, Previte began wearing a concealed recording device to meetings with Merlino and other family members, documenting hundreds of conversations about the family's criminal activities. The recordings Previte made provided extraordinarily detailed evidence of the family's operations. Unlike traditional wiretaps that captured only telephone conversations, Previte's body wire recorded face-to-face meetings where family members discussed criminal activities with a candor they would never display on the telephone. These recordings captured conversations about specific extortion schemes, including discussions of which businesses were being targeted, how much money was being demanded, and what consequences would follow if payments were refused. The gambling operations received extensive discussion in Previte's recordings. Family members talked about bookmaking operations, discussing the amounts being wagered, the percentages being paid to the organization, and problems with bettors who refused to pay their debts. These conversations provided prosecutors with evidence not only that illegal gambling was occurring, but also of the specific organizational structure that controlled these operations. The recordings identified who operated various gambling enterprises, who collected the proceeds, and how profits were distributed within the family. Loan sharking activities were similarly documented. Previte recorded conversations about money being loaned to various individuals, the interest rates being charged, and the methods used to collect when borrowers fell behind on payments. These recordings captured the casual way family members discussed using threats and violence to enforce payment, providing evidence of extortionate credit transactions that formed the basis for federal racketeering charges. The recordings also captured discussions of the family's internal politics and power structure. Conversations revealed tensions between Ralph Natale and Joey Merlino, documenting that Merlino wielded the real power despite Natale's nominal position as boss. Family members discussed their dissatisfaction with how profits were being distributed, complaints about Merlino's guzzling of gambling debts, and concerns about the attention his high-profile lifestyle was attracting from law enforcement. Perhaps most damaging were the recordings that captured family members discussing past acts of violence, while carefully avoiding explicit confessions to murder. The conversations contained enough detail and context to corroborate other evidence about the organization's violent history. These discussions demonstrated the culture of violence that permeated the organization and the willingness of its members to use deadly force to resolve disputes and eliminate threats. Previte's cooperation extended beyond simply recording conversations. He provided detailed debriefings to federal agents about the family structure, its criminal operations, and the roles of specific members. His insider knowledge allowed investigators to understand the significance of seemingly innocuous conversations and activities. He explained the criminal argot and coded language family members used, enabling prosecutors to present recorded conversations in ways that juries could understand. The investigation that Previte supported represented a massive commitment of law enforcement resources. Multiple FBI agents managed his cooperation, providing him with recording equipment, debriefing him after each recorded meeting, and ensuring his safety as he continued to operate within the organization. Federal prosecutors reviewed the recordings and guided the investigation toward evidence that would support specific criminal charges. The investigation required extraordinary patience, as building a comprehensive racketeering case demanded evidence of multiple criminal acts occurring over an extended period. Throughout this period, Previte continued to participate in family activities, maintaining his position while secretly working for the government. He attended meetings at the Bomb Bomb restaurant, participated in discussions of criminal activities, and continued to generate income for the organization. This dual role required considerable nerve, as discovery of his cooperation would certainly have resulted in his murder. Family members who suspected someone of being an informant did not conduct investigations or provide opportunities for explanation. They simply acted on their suspicions with lethal force. The risk extended beyond Previtt himself. Federal agents worried constantly about protecting his cover while gathering evidence. If family members noticed changes in his behavior or became suspicious of his questions about criminal activities, the investigation would end abruptly and probably violently. The agents managing Previtt had to balance the desire to gather comprehensive evidence against the need to protect their source. Each recorded meeting represented both an opportunity to collect evidence and a risk that Previtt's cooperation would be discovered. By the late 1990s, the investigation that Previtt supported had generated an enormous quantity of evidence. Hundreds of recorded conversations documented the family's criminal operations in meticulous detail. Federal prosecutors were building racketeering cases against the family's leadership, cases that would rely heavily on the evidence Previtt had collected. The investigation that had begun with one corrupt former police officer's decision to cooperate was approaching its culmination. However, the timing of the prosecution presented strategic challenges. Bringing charges too early might prevent investigators from gathering evidence about additional crimes or additional defendants. Waiting too long risked Previtt's cover being blown or the statute of limitations expiring on earlier offenses. Federal prosecutors had to determine the optimal moment to move from investigation to prosecution, to emerge from the shadows and arrest the targets they had been monitoring. As the decade drew to a close, law enforcement possessed detailed evidence of the Philadelphia crime family's criminal operations. They had documented the organizational structure, identified the key players, and recorded extensive evidence of racketeering activities. The foundation had been laid for prosecutions that would target not just individual crimes, but the enterprise itself, seeking to dismantle the organization through the federal racketeering statutes. The question was no longer whether charges would be brought, but when and against whom. Chapter 42: The Coming Storm. As 1999 began, the Philadelphia crime family appeared to be thriving under Joey Merlino's leadership. The family's criminal operations generated substantial income from gambling, loan sharking, and extortion. Merlino's high-profile presence in South Philadelphia demonstrated his confidence and power. The arrangement with Ralph Natala as nominal boss seemed to provide a buffer against law enforcement scrutiny. To observers watching the Bon Bon restaurant or reading newspaper accounts of Merlino's charitable events, the organization seemed firmly established. However, beneath this appearance of success, multiple threats were converging on the family. The evidence Ron Previtt had gathered provided prosecutors with detailed documentation of criminal activities spanning years. Other potential cooperating witnesses, alienated by Merlino's arrogance and treatment, were considering whether to assist law enforcement investigations. Federal agents had identified additional targets for electronic surveillance and were systematically mapping the family's organizational structure and criminal operations. The relationship between Ralph Natale and Joey Merlino was deteriorating as well. Natale increasingly resented his subordinate position to the younger, flashier Merlino. Disputes over money and decision-making authority created friction between the two men. The fiction that Natale was the actual boss became harder to maintain as Merlino's public profile grew and his control over day-to-day operations became more obvious. This internal tension would soon produce consequences that neither man anticipated. The very visibility that characterized Merlino's approach to organized crime leadership was creating vulnerabilities. Every photograph in the newspaper, every television news segment, every public appearance provided prosecutors with evidence of his position and activities. The large entourage that accompanied him everywhere created multiple potential witnesses to his conduct. The charitable events, while generating positive publicity, also demonstrated the financial resources at his disposal and the loyalty he commanded within the community. Traditional organized crime figures in other cities watched the Philadelphia situation with a mixture of fascination and dismay. Merlino's celebrity gangster approach violated principles that had governed successful organized crime operations for generations. His refusal to pay gambling debts created enemies in multiple crime families. His high-profile lifestyle attracted exactly the kind of law enforcement attention that careful bosses spent their careers avoiding. Many predicted that Merlino's approach would inevitably lead to his downfall. As the decade approached its end, all these factors were converging toward a crisis. Federal prosecutors were preparing indictments based on the evidence they had gathered. Internal tensions within the family were approaching a breaking point. The accumulation of enemies created by Merlino's conduct was generating both law enforcement cooperation and inter-family conflicts. The organization that appeared so powerful and stable was actually approaching a moment of catastrophic vulnerability. The Philadelphia crime family stood at the edge of a precipice, though few within the organization recognized the danger. The combination of aggressive prosecution, internal betrayal, and leadership arrogance would soon produce consequences that would fundamentally transform the organization. The era of Joey Merlino's dominance over Philadelphia organized crime was approaching its conclusion, though the manner of that conclusion would shock even those who predicted his eventual downfall. The seeds of destruction had been planted through years of recorded conversations, alienated associates, and law enforcement dedication. They were about to bear fruit in prosecutions that would decimate the family's leadership and reveal the extent to which the organization had been penetrated by cooperating witnesses and electronic surveillance. The coming storm would sweep away much of what remained of Philadelphia's organized crime family, leaving questions about whether the organization could survive the prosecutions that approached. The summer of 1999 marked a turning point in the Philadelphia underworld. On June 28th of that year, Joey Merlino was indicted by federal prosecutors and detained without bail. The initial charges focused on conspiracy to distribute more than 5 kilograms of cocaine and the unlawful use of communication facilities in drug trafficking. For Merlino, who had survived multiple assassination attempts on the streets, the real threat now came from within the federal courthouse. The indictment would soon expand into something far more comprehensive. Federal prosecutors filed a 36-count racketeering case that painted a picture of an organization involved in everything from the deadly serious to the almost comically mundane. The charges alleged murders and murder plots alongside gambling operations and extortion schemes. But the indictment also included charges related to theft of stolen goods that seemed to capture the full range of Philadelphia street crime. Electronics and ceiling fans, baby formula and bicycles, athletic sweatsuits, and even a stolen Lamborghini. This was the Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act in full force. RICO, as it was commonly known, had been designed specifically to prosecute organized crime by connecting various criminal activities to a single criminal enterprise. What had begun as a cocaine investigation had evolved into an attempt to dismantle what remained of the Philadelphia crime family through one comprehensive legal action. The strength of the federal case rested not on surveillance or wiretaps alone, but on something far more devastating to any criminal organization: cooperation from the inside. Several of Merlino's former associates had agreed to testify against him, each for their own reasons, each carrying their own stories of the life they were leaving behind. The most significant cooperator was Ralph Natale. In an unprecedented development, Natale became the first sitting American Mafia boss to cooperate with federal authorities. The man who had claimed the title of boss, who had worked with Merlino to rebuild the Philadelphia family, had agreed to testify against his former partner. The decision came after Natale faced serious drug trafficking charges of his own, and he chose cooperation over the prospect of dying in prison. For an organization built on loyalty and silence, having a boss-turned-witness represented a fundamental breakdown of the old codes. Gaetano Scafidi, known on the street as Tommy Horsehead, agreed to cooperate in 2000 while finishing a prison sentence. According to his later statements, Scafidi's decision was motivated by fear. He believed that Merlino's crew intended to have him murdered, and cooperation offered both protection and a chance at freedom. The calculation was simple: testify and live, or remain silent and risk everything. Peter Caprio, whose street name was the Crumb, faced charges for 2 murders when he made his decision to cooperate. Like the others, he chose the certainty of witness protection over the uncertainty of loyalty, and Ron Previte brought with him something uniquely valuable: hours of undercover recordings that captured the daily operations and conversations of Merlino's crew. The trial began in March of 2001, transforming the federal courthouse in Philadelphia into the stage for what would become a highly publicized legal spectacle. Merlino, always conscious of appearances, arrived each day dressed impeccably, maintaining the same confident demeanor he had shown throughout his career. The courtroom became a theater where 2 very different narratives would compete for the jury's belief. The prosecution's case was massive in scope. Over the course of 3 months, federal attorneys presented 50 witnesses and 943 pieces of evidence. They built their case methodically, witness by witness, document by document, attempting to prove that Merlino had led a criminal enterprise responsible for murders, extortion, and a range of other crimes. Ralph Nathaniel served as the government's star witness, spending 14 days on the stand. His testimony painted a picture of calculated violence and criminal ambition. According to Natali, he and Merlino had plotted together to take control of Philadelphia organized crime by hunting down and killing members of rival factions. He described meetings where murders were planned, territories were divided, and the future of the family was discussed. His testimony sought to portray Merlino not as a neighborhood bookmaker, but as a sophisticated criminal leader responsible for orchestrating serious violence. But the defense attorneys, led by Edwin Jacobs, mounted an aggressive challenge to Natali's credibility. They pointed to his cooperation agreement and the reduced sentence he had been promised in exchange for his testimony. They highlighted inconsistencies in his various statements to authorities. They portrayed him as a man motivated solely by self-preservation, someone willing to say whatever federal prosecutors wanted him to say if it meant avoiding dying in prison. The cross-examination was thorough and, at times, brutal. Defense attorneys presented Natali as a liar whose word could not be trusted, a man who had violated the very codes he claimed to have lived by, and who was now attempting to save himself by destroying others. They argued that his testimony was the product of coaching by federal prosecutors, designed to fit the narrative the government wanted to present rather than reflecting the truth of what had actually occurred. The jury heard from other cooperating witnesses as well, each telling their own version of events, each bringing their own credibility issues. Tommy Horsehead Scafidi testified about his time with the crew. Peter the Crumb Caprio described criminal activities he claimed to have participated in alongside Merlino. Ron Previte's recordings were played, offering the jury a chance to hear actual conversations from inside the organization. The defense strategy focused on attacking the credibility of these cooperating witnesses, while presenting Merlino as someone who had been in the wrong place at the wrong time, associating with the wrong people, but not necessarily directing or participating in the most serious crimes alleged. They acknowledged that Merlino had been involved in bookmaking and other illegal activities, but they challenged the prosecution's portrayal of him as a murderous crime boss. As the trial stretched from March into July, the daily courtroom proceedings were covered extensively by local media. Merlino's supporters often filled the gallery, while law enforcement officials and prosecutors worked to present their case with the thoroughness that RICO prosecutions demanded. The trial represented more than just the fate of one man. It was seen as a test of whether federal prosecutors could successfully prosecute the leadership of the Philadelphia crime family using cooperating witnesses whose credibility could be seriously questioned. On July 20, 2001, after weeks of deliberation, the jury returned with their verdict. The outcome represented something unexpected, a mixed result that could be interpreted as either a partial victory or a partial defeat, depending on one's perspective. The jury acquitted Merlino of all 3 counts of murder and 2 counts of attempted murder. These were the charges that could have resulted in life sentences, the most serious allegations in the entire indictment. The acquittal suggested that the jury had not fully accepted the testimony of Ralph Natali and the other cooperating witnesses when it came to the most serious violent crimes. They had apparently found reasonable doubt in the government's case regarding Merlino's direct involvement in murders. However, the jury did find Merlino guilty of racketeering charges. The specific acts that the jury found proven included conspiracy to extort street tax and protection money from bookmakers and businesses, illegal sports bookmaking operations, and receipt of stolen property, specifically ceiling fans, baby formula, and bicycles. These convictions painted a picture of traditional organized crime activities, the collection of tribute, the operation of gambling enterprises, and involvement in the movement of stolen goods. It was a nuanced verdict that reflected the jury's careful consideration of the evidence. They had accepted that Merlino was involved in racketeering activities, but they had rejected the prosecution's portrayal of him as a violent killer. The acquittals on the murder charges represented a significant blow to the government's case, and suggested that the defense strategy of attacking the credibility of cooperating witnesses had been at least partially successful. On December 3, 2001, Judge Herbert J. Hutton sentenced Merlino to 14 years in federal prison. Given that he had faced the possibility of life imprisonment, the sentence represented a considerable victory. When asked to comment on his conviction and sentence, Merlino's response captured his characteristic bravado and his sense of having dodged the worst possible outcome. "Ain't bad," he said. "Better than the death penalty." The trial and its outcome had significant implications for what remained of the Philadelphia crime family. The extensive cooperation by former members had demonstrated the fragility of the traditional codes of silence. Ralph Natale's decision to testify had shattered the notion that the position of boss carried with it an absolute commitment to omerta. The willingness of multiple associates to cooperate suggested an organization where self-preservation had replaced loyalty as the primary motivation. Yet the mixed verdict also suggested that juries were not necessarily willing to accept the word of cooperating witnesses without corroboration, particularly when those witnesses had clear motivations to fabricate or exaggerate their testimony. The acquittals on the murder charges indicated that the government's strategy of relying heavily on cooperators who had negotiated deals for reduced sentences had its limitations. For Merlino, the 14-year sentence meant a return to federal prison, but not the life sentence that had seemed possible when the trial began. He was 40 years old at the time of sentencing, and a 14-year term meant he would likely be released while still in his early 50s, assuming good behavior and time already served. It was a sentence he could survive, a period he could endure. The prosecution of Joey Merlino represented the culmination of years of federal investigation into the Philadelphia crime family. The extensive use of cooperating witnesses, the massive presentation of evidence, and the high-profile nature of the trial all reflected the government's determination to dismantle what remained of organized crime in Philadelphia. The mixed verdict, however, suggested that this battle would not be won through a single dramatic prosecution, but rather through a longer process of attrition. As Merlino prepared to begin his sentence, the Philadelphia crime family found itself in a state of uncertainty. With Natali cooperating and Merlino imprisoned, the leadership structure that had existed since the mid-1990s was gone. The family that had once controlled significant criminal interests throughout the city and South Jersey was now reduced to a scattered collection of crews and associates, many of whom were facing their own legal problems. The federal courthouse trial had been a spectacle, a public examination of the inner workings of organized crime in Philadelphia. The cooperating witnesses had lifted the veil on how the family operated, how it collected tribute, how it resolved disputes, and how it maintained control over its interests. The jury's mixed verdict had demonstrated both the power and the limitations of prosecution strategies that relied heavily on cooperating witnesses. For the residents of South Philadelphia, the neighborhood where Merlino had grown up and built his reputation. The verdict was discussed in barbershops and cafes, in social clubs and on street corners. Some saw it as justice served, others as an example of how the legal system could be manipulated by cooperating criminals seeking to save themselves. The debate reflected broader questions about crime, punishment, loyalty, and the changing nature of organized crime in America. The trial had also highlighted the evolution of law enforcement strategies. The use of RICO statutes, the cultivation of cooperating witnesses, the extensive surveillance and evidence gathering all represented a modern approach to prosecuting organized crime. The days when crime families could operate with relative impunity, protected by codes of silence and corrupted officials, were largely over. The federal government had developed sophisticated tools for penetrating these organizations and bringing their leaders to justice. As Merlino began serving his sentence, the story of the Philadelphia crime family entered a new chapter. The organization had survived government prosecutions before, had weathered internal conflicts and external challenges, but the combination of cooperating witnesses and RICO prosecutions represented a threat unlike anything the family had previously faced. The question was not whether the Philadelphia crime family would survive, but in what form and under whose leadership. The courtroom proceedings had been exhaustive, the evidence voluminous, the testimony dramatic. But in the end, the verdict reflected the complexity of prosecuting organized crime cases. The jury had carefully weighed the evidence, assessed the credibility of witnesses, and reached conclusions that were neither complete vindication nor total condemnation. They had found Merlino guilty of being what he had essentially acknowledged, being all along a bookmaker and racketeer who collected street tax and dealt in stolen goods. They had acquitted him of being a murderer. In the federal prison system, Merlino would serve his time knowing that he had avoided the worst possible outcome. 14 years was manageable, survivable. It was time that could be endured with the knowledge that there would be life after prison, that the story was not over. For a man who had built his reputation on resilience and defiance, the sentence represented another challenge to overcome, another obstacle to survive. The prosecution had achieved a conviction, but not the complete victory they had sought. The defense had avoided life imprisonment, but could not prevent incarceration. The verdict was a compromise, a mixed outcome that reflected the reality of how complex cases were often resolved in federal court. And for the Philadelphia crime family, it meant continuing to adapt to a changing world where the old certainties no longer applied, and where survival required constant adjustment to new threats and new realities.